So today I'm here with Jonathan Davis. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, well, hi Andrew.
Hello.
I am a wealth advisor, chartered financial planner, I'm an economist, and I also write and publish the 2 monthly Booms and Busts report.
Always enjoy that.
Cool, good. Which anyone can access by going on to the website jonathandaviswm.com
Okay.
and just subscribing. It's free. People will never be junk mailed, and nor will their details ever be sold.
Good. Okay. Although I might. You never know. Got to make a crust. So what do you think? What's your take on what's going on in the world today? Because I'd imagine that's a pretty expansive question these days. But what's your thoughts on it?
I'll start off by saying that I'm absolutely terrified. I'm terrified for the loss of our freedoms, which were started nearly 1,000 years ago with Magna Carta. And in the last 2 years, we've lost hard-won, hard-fought. People have died for our freedoms, and in just 2 years, they're being taken away from us.
And voluntarily as well, almost. It's like everyone just capitulated.
Well,
like that.
let me, your viewers, listeners might want to look at my badge. It's Huxley Brave New World, because that's what I believe we're in now, where a lot of people are saying that what we're actually in is Orwell's 1984, but I think there's a nuance there, because of course in 1984 Orwell said that imagine where there's a jackboot on your throat for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what's happening, because people are actually craving state support. They're craving the jackboots, but in a soft, fluffy way. A Boris Johnson, ruffled hair, ha ha ha, aren't I a nice guy, type of way. And that's what's terrifying. They're actually wanting it to happen to them. And it's happening. So why are we losing our freedoms? Well, surely most of your viewers will already have heard of The Great Reset, which was the 2019 book written by the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, which is, as I call them, the party of Davos. The hugely rich, powerful, connected, quote, elite, unquote. There's nothing elite about these people. They are the dregs of the earth as far as I'm concerned. But the Great Reset is what's happening. And again, many of your viewers will have heard the phrase, by 2030, you will own nothing and you'll be happy.
Except for Klaus Schwab, who'll still be a millionaire or multi-millionaire and will own tons. So
well,
does that make him unhappy?
Indeed. And ultimately, when you bring it down to its basest form, I said to my wife, probably in April 2020, just a few weeks after it all kicked off, I said, I'll tell you what this comes down to. This is the billionaires and the connected wanting to go to the airports and not having the plebs like ants frittering around the airport. No, this is our airport. Get away. I don't want to be held back half an hour to get my plane. They want to be driven in the limousines down the main roads of London, not having to be held up by the masses.
Zoo lanes like they have in Moscow.
Well, exactly the same. Because, of course, Marxism is exactly the same as fascism. Exactly the same, Nazism. So that's where we are politically, and that's the reason why we are where we are. My, what's the word, maître, whatever, I can't remember the French phrase, is money. Is helping people to make more money and save taxes and so on. So I'm in the business of investing. So my focus is financial markets, and the economy. So let's talk about the economy, because today's date is the 11th of April, 2022. What's that, 25 months after it all kicked off? I'm saying the word it. I'm making the reasonable assumption everyone knows what I'm talking about. Do we need to explain that,
Well, I don't
Andrew?
know, we might get a black mark. We've got to be careful. So we might get flagged up on something, but it's fine. We can go as close to the wind as we can.
So
This is Soviet Russia, after all. So.
After all, it certainly is. So we had a huge financial markets crash in March of 2020, which they blamed on a coronavirus. I've just written to my readers, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, anything that's been happening in the last 2 years and 1 month has been anything but the truth. So the idea that the financial markets crash when stock markets all over the world fell 30 to 50% in a month, which was the fastest and largest stock market crash in history from all-time highs. Because the all-time high in the States was towards the end of February 2020. By specifically the 23rd of March 2020, just a few weeks later, stock markets were down, as I say, 30 to 50%, an enormous crash. And they blamed that crash on the coronavirus. Well, stuff of nonsense. It's without a shadow of doubt that the crash was coming. Now, I admit, and I've written about this, I admit that my perception was the crash was coming in 2021. Okay, it came in March 20. Doesn't matter. But it was coming. There's no question it was coming. It had absolutely nothing to do with the coronavirus. So let's just establish that. But they used the C word as the excuse to print trillions and trillions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever. And this is where it starts to get really ugly. In America alone, allow me to take this off, I think I've made my point from what's on there. In America alone, they printed $10,000 billion. $10 trillion. I feel sometimes, or a lot of the time, that the bulk of folk don't quite understand how big a trillion is. But if I say to you that if you add $1 every second, then in 31,500 years, you'll get to a trillion.
Yep.
Okay? That's the magnitude of a trillion. And they printed 10 of them. It was 40%. $4 trillion went to the top 1%. 35%, 3.5 trillion, went to the bottom 90%. So in other words, the top 10% got $6.5 trillion. And as I say, they blamed it on the coronavirus. Nothing be further from the truth. So they bailed everyone out, basically. Everyone who matters. Everyone who's connected.
Bondholders and shareholders who, under capitalism, should have gone bust.
Yes.
Had a cash call maybe to shore up the bank that they were banking with. All the worst gambles they made got paid off in full, as it did in 2007
and 2008.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
You're absolutely correct. So the loss of freedoms, the printing of money, coronavirus, passports, restrictions on travel, restrictions, as you know, we're seeing in Peru, in Shanghai, there's another country just off the top, I can't remember immediately, but we're seeing riots around the world. Why? Because there's no food. People are not allowed to leave their apartments, leave their houses, to go to the grocery stores. Now, some of your viewers will be thinking, oh, well, yeah, that's because there was lockdowns, so there's been a limitation on supplies, on logistics. Well, yes, but read The Great Reset. Read the book. This is exactly what they've planned. They demand absolute control by the populace. So, vax passes, for example, that's just a precursor to digital identity, which the World Health Organization is working on right now. And then when we have digital identity, that, you have to have certain ticks, no crosses, in order to be able to travel. And then add that in with what's coming next, which is central bank digital currencies, which are what? Well, it means that in the UK, for example, the Bank of England will be where you will have your banking. You will have your accounts. You will only allowed to be with one bank. Now, I'm not saying that Barclays and Santander, etc., won't be around, but I am saying that they will, in effect, be subsidiaries, just like the Soviet economic system. Yep. They will be subsidiaries of a Gosbank, or in other words, the Bank of England. And everything that goes through Santander will ultimately be controlled and regulated and supervised by the Bank of England. And the central bankers' bank, the Bank of International Settlements, based in Basel in Switzerland, the managing director in the last year has said that CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, will give us the power to control every account. That is a paraphrase of what he has said publicly. And it all links in with the WHO, United Nations, and hence I'm absolutely terrified, because in the most basic level, when the central bank controls your account, let's say you do 63 miles an hour in a 60. We all know you shouldn't, but tell me anyone who doesn't.
Or hasn't, yes.
And doesn't. Mm-hmm. And this thing will always be with you. So this thing is going to pick up that you've done 63 in a 60. And it's automatically going to send that signal to the central bank, 100 quid docked from your account. A fine. No appeal, no discussion, it's just happened. Mm-hmm. Now, some of you viewers might think, well, that doesn't sound so terrible. Okay, let me give you another example then. What about you say something on Twitter that the state, capital S, doesn't like? First level is Twitter, of course, suspends you. Second level is the central bank decides you need an extra tax. Yeah? And they can do it automatically. The AI in the system will do it automatically. You think there will be an appeal? There will be no appeal. It'll just happen. And the phrase will be used, after careful consideration. The fact is, it'll be 5 minutes after you wrote this thing and published this thing on Twitter that they don't like. You used a word like ivermectin, for example, or another word or another phrase that the state doesn't want you to be using. Because perish the thought, we should have any thoughts which are different to those that the state requires us to have.
And I wouldn't mind them actually saying that, but they're so wrong on so many things. Sure. I would say, is it the intent is actually what the what the outcome that is, what they want. What we're seeing, the results that we see, is actually the intention, not what they say. The platitudes, oh, we're doing this to help the poor or the aged, protect old people. All these things that soften everybody up, because who can argue against that?
But that's the point. Marxists have always used the rationale for their activities.
Human shield, yes.
as the Nazis did in the 1930s, für ihre Sicherheit, for your protection, which encompasses everything that Marxists essentially say. It's for your benefit, for your protection, for your security. It's for the children. It's for the aged. It's for the immigrants. It's for the this. It's for the that. It's whatever. They want it to appear nice. So, just going further on CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, they could use it to manipulate the people. They could say, you do and say and write the things that we want you to say and write and think. Then how about they do negative taxation for these people? They give them actual state subsidies. They literally put money into their accounts. Or in China, they've had CBDC for 5 years. And they've been giving them money, they've been giving people money, but they've been saying in recent months, you've got 30 days to spend this.
Yeah, it's a wasting asset. Yeah.
And if you don't, then it's gone forever. And also, if you don't use it up, well, that means that you don't need much money. So any money we might give in the future will be, say, half the amount. Well, maybe you just didn't need it that month, but maybe you normally do. And this is how they're controlling the masses. So, what's going on in politics? The elite are rapidly taking over. The masses are seeing their rights and liberties being taken away left, right, and centre in very short order. Economically, well, in the last 2 years, we've seen the inflation, the cost of living, the cost of doing business absolutely soar. Have you seen the cost of your home energy recently?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The state in the United Kingdom actually caps the increases that energy companies can place on bills, on tariffs, but that cap was just increased last week by 52%. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know many people or anyone who's had a 52% wage rise.
Yeah.
So, and then you look at, for example, filling up your tank at the pump. 2 years ago, it was £1 a litre. It's now £1.80 a litre. That's an 80% increase.
And 80% of it tax as well. You know, they could easily have adjusted that so it didn't actually go up at all. They said, well, okay, no more tax on it. What would the real price of the underlying petrol or diesel be? You know?
Well, I can tell you that because in America, in most states, there's very little tax on fuel at the pump. Not that America taxes you less, it just doesn't tax you there.
Yeah.
And on average, Americans have seen their cost of filling up their tanks go from $2 a gallon, not a litre, a gallon, to $6 or $7 a gallon. Now, America is an absolutely huge country. And unless you live in the really huge cities like New York or Chicago, no one goes by public transport.
Yeah.
That's an exaggeration, but it's generally accepted. Everyone drives. And of course, to get to work, you're not just driving a mile.
Yeah.
You're driving 20, 30, 40, 50 miles each way, 5 or 6 days a week.
I know Americans will do 100 miles just to go for their favourite burger place or ribs place or something.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a totally different mentality to ours, where if you have to travel half an hour, you think, oh, do I really want to do that? But in America, that's like going next door.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the effect on household bills in America in the last 2 years, where previously they were paying perhaps $20, $25 to fill up their tanks. Now they're paying nearly $100 every time they fill up their tanks. Now again, that's a 200 or 300% increase in the price of fuel. Never mind the cost of heating and lighting their homes. So of course in America, inflation is huge, just like it is everywhere else. But this is the effect of the lockups. I don't call them lockdowns.
Yeah, probably
the
more
lockups that we've all experienced, the massive logistic nightmares of manufacturing things with people obviously not getting to work and so on. And China and Southeast Asia have just not been distributing the product that they used to. And above all, Taiwan hasn't been producing and distributing the semiconductors for everything that we use, particularly vehicles. I read just last week that Germany's car production is down 15%. Now, if Germany's car production is down that much, then I can tell you Germany is in economic recession as we speak. And that means the European Union is in recession as we speak. And I just wrote to my clients that America is going into recession any day now. It might already have peaked, the economy, after 2 years of breakneck growth and, of course, huge inflation. Because inflation is, well, huge inflation, should I say, is recessionary. Clearly, in the UK, we've heard horrendous stories of average families whose monthly household bills on energy have gone up from £80 a month to £250 a month. In America, similarly, and on top of that, then the cost of filling their car tanks. And as I say, they drive everywhere. So clearly, if you're having to spend more on the basic necessities, think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic necessities, accommodation, heat, light, food costs are going up, then of course it means that you can spend less on the fun things in life, including travel, holidays, clothes, and perhaps replacing your car less often than you used to, and so on. And that, of course, means that we're buying fewer goods and probably services too. Therefore, we're entering, or we've already entered, a vicious spiral down economically. In other words, we have entered, or we are rapidly entering, an actual recession. Something which we haven't seen since 2008, well over a decade ago. And it's happening as we speak.
And caused by government action. It wasn't
Absolutely.
It wasn't anything to do with markets. It wasn't what people would say capitalism. This is governments absolutely destroying businesses in this country. Someone said 360,000 businesses have been either really severely affected or have gone just completely. Smaller businesses, but of course that just leaves the big boys fighting for what's left because the competition has gone. But it's all government action and inaction as well.
So those who claim that the coronavirus caused all our problems, if they'd said that a week or 2 or 3 or 4 weeks after our problems started becoming evident, then they might have had some credibility. But if they're still saying that 12, 18, 24 months after the fact, well, they are either incredibly stupid, or they're lying, and or they're directly benefiting from it all to the detriment of everyone else. In other words, they don't have your benefit in mind, your protection in mind. It's all for their benefit. It certainly has been government after government policy around the world that has created the dire situation that we're in. I refer you again to the book, The Great Reset, author Klaus Schwab, who started and runs the World Economic Forum.
Okay, so what about small business? Because obviously you've seen a lot of them get really hurt. My business itself was down 95%. You would be taking multiples of 10,000 a month, and we were taking £200 and £300 a month for about 3 months in a row back at the start of last year. And it's like, and it's still, we're about 75% down on what we would have been. What was a roaring start to 2019? We're still 75% down on that, which means we're sort of, it's now worth continuing because it's on that cusp. We're not losing money, and we're starting to be able to pay some back if it carries on the way it is. But a lot of people have just been absolutely destroyed by it. And I was in a good position financially before that. It was only by luck, that I was in that position, or planning, that I got in that position. We were able to ride the storm, and I thought, well, I can't keep doing this forever, So, and it just must have been horrendous. People who owned a gym or a restaurant. I spoke to the local guy who runs an Indian restaurant around here, and he said, I've got 3 months' salaries and overhead money in the bank. After that, we're done. And it was them taking takeaways out to people was the only way they could survive. And they said that was just a little bit on the top just to keep our name in the business. It wasn't even a profitable thing. And we had to find a way to try and make that actually profitable. But this is the stories you keep hearing over and over again, people devastated. And the thing that gets me is when you do talk to people about it, so you feel bad saying it to them, but they go, oh, well, it'll improve. It's like, no, it's not going to improve. And there just seems to be this resignation that they don't seem to think that there's nothing is causing it. It's like if government didn't do what it was doing, we would soon find a way very quickly to protect the people who are vulnerable. Nobody wants to infect them, and everybody else, the strong carry on. It's a pretty good expression to protect the vulnerable, the strong carry on, and people take a risk. I'm 60 years old, you're probably catching me up as well. You don't care if you think, well, if I got it, fine, you're strong enough to take it on. But older people and people with vulnerabilities, keep them out of the way. But they've done the reverse. They've just kept everybody out of the way. Just saying this is the result is they're protect. But if old people are getting even a flu or something like that, you think, well, actually, I don't give old people a flu. If I have to wear a mask when I'm going to visit my neighbours and it's flu season, you think, well, do I really want to do that? But they never bothered about it before. But now it's become like a life or death thing, hasn't it?
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's
I'm just taking government on face value. I'm taking it on face value.
Sure,
Yeah.
Understood.
Yes.
Okay, well that's the brainwashing, of course.
Yeah.
The media organisations were given the most amount they've ever been given in history by the government to push the narrative. Again, terrifying. There is no difference, to use the metaphor you've been using, there's no difference between that and the Soviet Union, North Korea, and so on. Yes, SMEs have been hit hard, particularly, of course, in retailing, in food, because, of course, part of the Great Reset is that we all stay in our homes. We don't travel to anywhere, including a grocery store. We don't go to the cinema. We don't go to the shop. But instead, the 100-billionaire Jeff Bezos supplies us with everything, and his ilk.
Universal basic income and Netflix, sort of.
Universal basic
Amazon
income.
and Netflix. Yeah.
Universal basic income is definitely coming in, of course, as well. That's part of the Great Reset because they are telling us that there will be no jobs, so people will not be able to look after themselves. Therefore, Huxley comes into his own. We will look after you for Ihre Sicherheit, for your protection. And again, with a central bank digital currency, there's your UBI, but you have to spend it within 30 days. And also, if you say something you shouldn't, you're not going to get it next month. It's blindingly obvious how they will be able to control the populace. Terrifying. It's all about state control over the individual. There must be no individuals. Never mind the fact that people are actually dying, and over the next few years, serious scientists and doctors who are not funded by the state, by the pharma industry. Serious men and women are telling us that these mRNA drugs, which are still experimental,
Yeah.
and if they weren't, then they couldn't get people to take them. They couldn't force it upon people. So never mind the fact that businesses are going under. Literally, people are going 6 feet under. Your viewers can be throwing their slippers at their computer screens right now and saying, this guy's an absolute idiot. I suggest they go and do some research. That's all I can suggest.
Yeah. And it's with experimental things, it's like, you think, well, okay, taking government on face value that old people are the ones most likely to die. Okay, well, take the vaccine if you want to. Any serious scientist worth their salt will be saying, okay, it's experimental. There's no midterm and long-term testing data on it. We don't know what the side effects will be, so it has to be treated with caution. So you would just do that with vulnerable. Perhaps my parents would do it. They're 88. They're getting quite frail. So you go, well, have that. If that's what they think is going to be, they'd be the people you test it on. But to force it on healthy people it tells you it's the giveaway that there's something far more sinister.
And now they're forcing it on 5 to 11-year-olds.
Yes.
Yeah. And it is so terrifying.
Yeah.
There has been an exponential increase in teenagers and 20-somethings having heart disease, myocarditis.
Myocarditis. Football players as well?
Not just footballers, hundreds of expert, professional and non-professional sportsmen and women. Just last week, 15 tennis players in the Miami Open had to bow out. Never happened in history.
Yeah.
And the media are not asking a single question. It's frightening. And hence, my first sentence to you, I am terrified.
And of all the places for it to happen, Florida,
Well, indeed. DeSantis, the governor there, everyone that might see things as we see it is saying the guy's amazing. He should be the next president of the United States. Well, in many ways, he's done very good things. But let me point out that 85% of Floridians have been jabbed.
Yeah. It's got a massive elderly population there, isn't it? Because where everyone goes to retire. So, yeah. But it's, as you say, frightening times, scary times. And only time will tell when, what is going to be the mid and long-term effect of this. So.
And let's now go back to the economy, about mid and long-term effects. Let's move away from the big C and the Great Reset.
And the big C is doing it. Yeah.
So, as I said, huge inflation is recessionary. We've seen car production fall. We've seen production of practically everything fall. And clearly when that happens, there's less sales. With less sales, you go into a vicious spiral down. We are rapidly heading towards recession, which means, of course, that the size of the economy is going to fall. There's going to be materially higher unemployment. We're also actually going to see an abatement in the level of inflation. I'm not saying that prices overall are going to fall, but we will see the rate of increase in prices fall quite substantially. Although the official stats are, in the UK, the retail price index is about 7% now, year on year. As I say, go to the fuel pump, look at your energy costs, look at the cost of buying food from the grocery store and so on. I don't think anyone truly believes, whatever they might say, that inflation is only 7%. And indeed, if your viewers go to shadowstats.com,
very good website,
they will see that if we calculated inflation in the same way as we did in the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan, because of course they've changed it in the last 40 years fraudulently, we would actually have 15 or so % inflation. As I say, when we had proper, honest calculation of inflation, if we use the same methodology, we would actually be seeing 15% inflation just now. What was that?
I say, heaven forbid. I mean,
yeah.
And if you don't get a 15% pay rise,
yeah,
you've had a 15% pay cut. Or
indeed, and people are not getting 15% wage rises; they're getting 5, 6, 7% wage rises, and it always happens, always without any instances differently, that when inflation rises, aggregate earnings do not keep up with inflation. Thus, not only against the fraudulent inflation are people's wealth reducing, but actually against real inflation, the cost of living, the cost of doing business, people's wealth is diminishing rapidly. And I wrote at the beginning of the year in the Booms and Busts report that it started in 2021. By 2025, which is 5 years, the average household will see their financial position fall, their standard of living fall, an average of 20%. We are rapidly moving to whole swathes of the population in actual early 20th century levels of poverty. I mean, real poverty, like you used to see in the movies, relating to Victorian days. Real, serious poverty. People haven't experienced that in decades.
It's going to be a shocker for them, isn't it?
Old people have experienced it. Really old people in the 1930s. Then there was rationing, of course, during the war and post-war into the 50s. But since then, people haven't really experienced much poverty. Yes, there were great problems, of course, in the 1970s. That was the last time. But even then, people still got by. I mean, okay, everyone talks about the boys from the black stuff in the early 80s, the mines closing down. But that largely was the woke left media and being anti-Thatcher and anti-Reagan, in other words, anti-capitalism. It wasn't really remotely closely as bad as they made out. I'm not suggesting there wasn't 3 million unemployed at the peak, but we were moving from basically the post-war low technology era to the 1980s and 90s, much higher technology era, and indeed more prosperity. And look at the prosperity we've had in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s because of what Thatcher and Reagan did in the 1980s. And then, of course, they withered it all away. Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, and this idiot now. They withered it away and created more and more Marxism until now we have a Marxist society. Yeah. Anyone who believes remotely that we do not live in a Marxist society has got their head in the ground. They need to pull their head up and start looking around and doing some serious research. Just going back to this recession.
Okay.
In this recession, which will last anywhere between 6 and 18 months, it will not be like 2008, which was a shortish, huge recession. It lasted a year or 18 months. It was very big. The stock market fell nearly 60%. Unemployment soared. And what did they do? They bailed everyone out. Well, that was their short to medium term fix. And of course, it kept the plate spinning for, indeed, the Big Short for another 10 plus years. Well, here we are again We had a huge crash and a mini recession in the last couple of years, and and then we had growth. And now we're going into another recession. And then they're going to print another 10 or 20 trillion dollars globally. And then we'll have another spurt of growth. And then we'll have another recession, which will last another year or so. Then we'll print another 10 or 20 trillion. Then we'll have it. In other words, as indeed I explained to you a few weeks ago, over the next 10 or 20 years, I'm projecting there will be no net economic growth at all. We will have spurts up and then down, and up and down on a net basis, unless you're smart and connected and you know what's going on. You are going to lose everything, because you're going to bet the farm as things are going up. You're going to lose the farm as things go down. And whenever things are going up, and they'll go up for a year or two, maybe even 3 years, you will believe, oh, this is it. It's going to be like 2009 to 2020. No, it's going to be a couple of years up, a year or two down, a couple of years up, a year or two down. And in a hugely indebted society, that's going to hurt 90% of the population. So
it's so difficult to plan in that situation as well, isn't it? You can't plan anything mid and long term. I'm talking about businesses. It's very hard to see beyond the next stimulus. That's what they'll all be looking for. I mean, it's just everybody is then tied to this whole counterfeiting scheme, Ponzi scheme that's going on, and it forces everybody, to sort of get on board with it. Really, doesn't it?
So businesses, entrepreneurs, or even people who just work for a business wanting to get on. They want that business to succeed because they work there.
Yeah. And it provides goods and services to you and I, which we enjoy. It's not like people are just out there producing things for a profit. We buy them and we reward them because we like what they're producing. Otherwise, we go somewhere else.
Indeed. And in the ideal world, in the capitalist world, that's exactly what would happen. But of course, that's not, in fact, what happens. So as you quite rightly say...
Punish every good deed, yes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
As you quite rightly say, people will find it difficult over time to plan in such a setup where I'm thinking for about 20 years or so, whether it's 15 years or 30 years, I couldn't say, in an era of financial repression, which incidentally is what we had post-World War II until the late 1970s. There will be capital controls. You will not be able to take lots of money out of the country.
I remember that, going to America in 82, and you weren't allowed to, I think it was like, if you had more than $10,000, you were in a lot of trouble.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. So you couldn't buy property out of the country, for example.
Yeah.
Yes, and they'll keep interest rates low. We need to come back to interest rates in due course and talk about what's happening just now. But they will essentially keep interest rates low for the next 20 or 30 years. It's generally unknown that economies with high interest rates prosper and economies with low interest rates diminish. Whereas, of course, the media and the politicians and the central bankers and the bankers all are desperate, have brainwashed everyone into believing,
even themselves,
that reducing interest rates helps and raising interest rates hinders. And that, of course, is true in the relatively short term. But in the long term, it has been empirically shown, particularly by Professor Dr. Richard Werner, anyone can look him up, that higher interest rates economies do better than lower interest rates economies. They are going to globally keep interest rates low for the next generation. So the top 10% will do very well. The top 1% will do fantastically well. But the bottom 90%, as you say, when things are getting going, the problem is They're going to borrow like Billy-O, thinking, oh, this is my chance to make something. 18 months, 30 months later, annihilated in the next recession. And it's going to be up and down and up and down and up and down, getting nowhere. It's no longer going to be 10 or 20 years up and a couple of years down. That's what we've had. It's true for the last 50 years, but that's not what it's going to be like in the next generation. Let's talk about interest rates, which is directly relevant.
I want to ask you questions as well about what do you think? What could we do if you were Chancellor of the Exchequer, or you had the power to do it? What could you do that would turn all this round? But that can be something we can tag on the end. But
you see, what we've had for the last 50 years or so is we've seen, as everyone knows, we've seen inflation come down. In the mid-1970s in the United Kingdom, inflation peaked above 20% a year.
I remember. It was terrible for my family. It sent my father bankrupt. Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was just like...
It bankrupted a load of folk.
Yeah.
Because, people today just kind of assume, well, high inflation means that I'll get much higher wage increases and my house price will go up 10, 20, 30% a year. No. As inflation has been falling, interest rates have been falling, which means mortgage and borrowing rates have been falling. That's been a primary tailwind to house prices. Because clearly, if a mortgage rate is, say, 20%, and then it goes down to literally 1%, well, if previously all you could borrow was, say, £50,000 because of the monthly cost, but now you can borrow £500,000, well, the more you can borrow, the more you can pay to buy a house. But 2 years ago, mortgage rates got to an all-time low. General interest rates, what we call market rates, got to a multi-decade, like a 60-year low. In economics and in markets, governments, of course, borrow, the government debt. And a major financial instrument is the 10-year government bond. What does that mean? It means that the government is borrowing from you, an individual, a pension fund, another country, for, say, 10 years. And the government pays an interest rate for 10 years, and then after 10 years, they pay the debt back. Well, in the 1970s, governments all around the world paid huge levels of interest to borrow any money. So they were desperate. All the governments were desperate to get inflation and interest rates down. And that's exactly what happened from the late 70s, early 80s, depending upon where you were in the world. Inflation and interest rates have been falling for the last 40 or 50 years. Until March of 2020, the interest rate that the UK government was paying to borrow money over 10 years got down to 0.07%. Practically, it cost nothing to borrow money over a 10-year period. Whereas, as I say, in the 1970s, the UK government was paying nearly 20% a year to borrow money. Hence, debt has exploded in the last 2 generations. Well, where can you go from 0.07%? Can you go down?
Yeah.
Hardly. Conceivably, you could go minus. You could perhaps go to minus 0.5%, as indeed Japan did, Sweden, the European Central Bank, Switzerland. But I can tell you, everyone knows that you cannot sustain a negative government borrowing rate. You can't.
And it's horribly destructive to every price mechanism that's out there as well, isn't it?
Well, indeed, because if you haven't got an interest rate that truly reflects the economic conditions, and how can a negative interest rate, here, I'll lend you £100, Andrew, and I'll give you £1 a year to take my £100. Yeah. Well, how can that be responsible at all?
Well, it's there to destroy the price mechanism, isn't it?
Right.
It's intentional. Yeah.
So, and that's the point. So, technically and practically, you cannot have a negative interest rate, a negative borrowing rate in the long term. You can have it for relatively short periods, as indeed countries have, and the European Central Bank is 19 countries now, but you can't sustain it in the long term. So, from 0.07% in the UK, and to give you another example, in the US, it went down to 0.4%. That's the 10-year borrowing rate. So again, practically zero. Yeah. After decades of falling inflation and falling interest rates, the interest rate can now do, in essence, three things. It can go down, but not much, and certainly not for long. It can stay flat, or it can go up. Now, imagine the United Kingdom with 20% mortgage rates compared to 1% mortgage rates that we've had for the last 10 years. Is it fair to say that that would annihilate the UK economy?
I remember interest rates being 15% in the early 90s.
Yes,
yeah.
When a house was £40,000. Yeah. Not, as in the south of England, the average house price is £600,000. So that's the difference. Of course, interest rates, it could get to 15%, but you'd bring house prices down 90%. Thus, there is no way on earth, and as I say, I'm a financial analyst, there's no way on earth that the powers that be will allow interest rates to rise dramatically. Now, in the last 25 months, since the low point of March 2020, the UK 10-year borrowing rate, the government borrowing rate, has gone from 0.07% to 1.8%. In the US, it's gone from 0.4% to 2.7%. Now, if you as a corporation have borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or even billions, and you have seen, because your borrowing rate is going to be somewhat correlating with the government borrowing rate, if you've seen your borrowing rate go from, say, 1% to 3%, you've just seen your interest cost treble. There's no way on earth that that is going to go from 3% to 10%. It's not going to happen. So this is one of the symptoms or the results of financial repression, which is an economic term. They are going to do whatever they need to do to keep interest rates low for the next generation. And if you can imagine an XY axis where you've got interest rates along the Y-axis and time or years along the X-axis. So we've seen interest rates come down for decades. And in fact, as everyone knows, the base rate was basically zero, almost, for 10 years. And indeed, government borrowing rates hovered around 1.5% to 3% for 10 years. We then went through the imaginary floor down to practically zero or less than 0.5%. Within a few months, we went straight back into what we call this channel, a horizontal channel. And whereas interest rates have come down for decades, we have been in this channel, apart from this short period in March, April, May of 2020. We have been in this channel now for over 2 years, And I believe we will effectively be in this channel for the next generation.
Stuck in a rut.
How are they going to achieve keeping interest rates low for a generation? Because everyone believes that if inflation rises, interest rates must rise. And of course, inflation has soared in the last 2 years. And yes, interest rates have gone up, say, a couple of %. But what is to stop interest rates going up 5%, 10%? And this is where the authorities will step in. The central bank, for example, will buy government bonds by the hundreds of billions with electronically printed money. They'll just create money out of thin air, as they've been doing for 30 years. And they will hand money to the pension funds, to the other country lenders. They will buy their bonds, and notionally what that will do is that will raise the price of bonds, which is government loans, government borrowings. And I would ask your viewers just to take my word that the maths are, as bond prices rise, interest rates fall. So they will create an artificial demand for government bonds. They will buy bonds, the price will rise, the interest rates will fall. And secondly, and this is even more terrifying than the printing of money out of thin air, they will actually mandate UK pension funds and the like to buy government bonds. So your viewers' pension funds will be forced to buy government bonds. Now, let me take your viewers back to something I just said a minute or two ago. As bond prices rise, interest rates fall. The corollary is, by the way, for decades, as interest rates have fallen, bond prices have risen. But if interest rates are going to stay in a channel for the next generation, it therefore means that bond prices will do nothing for a generation. Whilst your viewers' costs of living are rising double digits per annum. So if they've got 20, 30, 40, 50% of their pensions in bonds, 20, 30, 40, 50% of their pension funds are going to grow not at all, while their costs of living are going to be growing double digits per annum. So the other part of their pensions, which is going to be shares normally for most folk, they're going to have to do 2 or 3 times as much in order for the pension funds to make any money, to achieve the challenge, to meet the challenge of inflation. And I can tell you, as a wealth advisor, not my clients, but 98% of portfolios, be they private clients, ordinary folk, or the big institutional pension funds, 98% of portfolios have a high allocation to bonds. And over the next 10, 20 years, pension funds are going to be annihilated purely by inflation, because people don't know what's invested in their pensions. And they should not be touching bonds with a barge pole for the next generation.
And it's all these people that are doing this, the financial repression, again, all in the interest of looking after you. It's the altruism, which is just so false, the altruism you hear, and you just think they're just destroying people.
Yes,
they're doing the exact opposite.
The exact opposite.
What they're saying.
They're destroying 90% of the population.
Yeah.
90%.
Yeah. It's shocking. Isn't it?
It goes back to my first sentence.
Yeah.
I'm terrified. Now, I hasten to say, my family and my clients will be all right, because they actually have a wealth advisor who understands what's going on, and irrespective of what your viewers might think of my position on politics, and whether or not they think I should be wearing a tinfoil hat, that's irrelevant. On pure, hard investing, everything I'm saying should make sense to everyone who's watching.
Okay. And so what would you think would be, you were in Chancellor of the Exchequer, or you could set economic policy, what would be the way forward? Or would you just let it play itself out?
Well, the problem is no one like me is ever going to get high office in politics. Politics is such a crooked activity. You have to please as many people as possible. If you don't, you'll never get on the first rung, which is a candidature for Parliament, or even as a council. Well, it's quite easy to become a candidate for councillor, but never MP. And even if you do become an MP, and even if you are a Conservative with a small c, and I don't actually see any or many true Conservatives throughout the 651 MPs in the United Kingdom.
Even Steve Baker saying we're socialists now.
There you go. There is no way on earth that I could envisage a Margaret Thatcher ever happening again. I apologise. I can't envisage it happening for the next 10 or 15 years. If and when it gets as bad as the mid-1970s, when there was the 3-day power workers, 3-day strike, and we were all eating our dinners by candlelight, and the bins were not being picked up, and dead bodies were not being buried, and worse than that, believe it or not, when that happens, either of two things are going to happen. Either the great resetters will have won, and nothing will ever take power from them ever again, or a Margaret Thatcher somehow gets to the top.
So you think it's going to be an individual will come along and be able to do something if they can? But I was a bit more being just like, as I thought, what is needed to happen?
What is needed is free markets.
Yeah.
What is needed is free
deregulation.
speech. Is free speech. Yeah. People should be allowed to say whatever they want in public, not be censored, and not be declassified, and not be taken off Twitter and Facebook, not be taken off the media. I liken the last couple of years a bit to the Brexit campaign in 2016, in the sense that although the media, to a man and woman, was anti-Brexit, in other words, Remain, at least everyone knew that there was two different positions. Now, nobody even knows that there's an alternative to the stated narrative. And that's also terrifying. So first we need free speech. And indeed, a slightly potentially positive movement, literally in the last week or two. Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet, well, according to known wealth, we don't know how much Putin has, we don't know how much the Saudi sheikhs have, and so on. But known wealth has just bought, we're not quite sure, but somewhere between 9 and 15% of Twitter. And interestingly, a revelation, if that's the right word, or announcement just today, funnily enough, when it became known that he'd bought 9%, Twitter's board put out, sorry, is there a point? There is a point to the story in Elon Musk, which I'll come to, as to what it's got to do with what I've been talking about. Twitter's board put out suddenly a new article of association, a new rule of Twitter, which had never been there before. But all of a sudden, if you're a serving board member, you would not be able to own more than 14.9% of the company, either directly or indirectly, or have control over more than 14.9. Wow. So what did Elon Musk announce yesterday, and it became apparent today? I'm not joining the board.
Yeah.
Whereas last week, he'd been given a board directorship.
That's why they came and offered him the thing. It was a trap.
Indeed. So he said, I'm not joining the board. So why have I brought all this up? Because on the face of it, we shall see whether or not it's actually true, but prima facie, Elon Musk is a free speech campaigner. And if that is true, and he takes control of Twitter, well, as I wrote to my clients indeed just last week, it's therefore the most likely outcome that Twitter becomes again the world's market square for free speech. And that could be an absolute game changer for everything. Immediately, it will become freely publishable about all the lies of the last 25 months. And that will be a game changer for hundreds of millions of folk around the developed world. So we need free speech. Secondly, we need free markets. We need capitalism. For 5 nanoseconds, metaphorically, I got into a Twitter argument with a Marxist just a few days ago, who told me how terrible the capitalism that we have is for society and so on. I said, you don't even understand what capitalism is.
If you think that's capitalism.
Because the last thing that we have is capitalism. Yeah. What we have is Chinese-style capitalism, where the corporation and state are intermingled. What's the phrase people say? Spoiler alert. Benito Mussolini, in the late 1930s, called it fascismo.
Yeah.
That, what we have is fascism, which is just a bastardization of Marxism. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Mussolini was a communist. He used to write for a communist paper. He was heavily into Marxism.
Most people who are well known were communists.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's the exception to the rule that they see the light and they get the point. So we need to stop keeping interest rates low. We need to stop bailing out failed businesses. We need to let the market determine what goes on. Now, that doesn't mean that the true needy would be left in the gutter. It doesn't mean that at all. All you have to do is look at the literature of the second half of the 19th century as the West was becoming more and more prosperous in Victoriana. You were seeing fewer and fewer people in abject poverty as the West got more and more prosperous. Because in the 19th century, we had a thing called free markets, which in some parts of the world ended, particularly in 1917, about 2,500 miles northeast of where we are.
And as I was speaking to Dominic Frisby in one of the earlier podcasts I did, and in his book Life After the State, he was talking about, the question I often ask people of a leftist persuasion: what was there before the NHS? And they'll often say nothing. You just died in the street. And then you say to them, but there was 360,000 mutual and friendly societies, but were giving healthcare as good as you could get in those days, which wasn't particularly good.
They had no technology, of course.
Yes, you could die of diabetes, you could die of, a cut, just get infected, flu, influenza, diphtheria.
We know how grossly overexpensive healthcare is in the United States, but there are small GP practices and small hospitals which will not accept insured patients. So you have to fund the care yourself. Unsurprisingly, the cost of care is a tenth where insurance is involved.
That's it.
And the quality of care is far better, far superior to the quality of care under the insurance contracts. But people don't get this.
No. And there was a great book. I remember studying it for English back in the late 70s, and it was called Like Christ the Candleford. There was a series about that, but it's nothing like the original Flora Thompson thing. And she went through what she said. Look, there was no deaths. In that area, kids were well fed. This was in rural sort of Oxfordshire, and it's an eye opener of what they had. They grew their own vegetables and had a pig and chickens and whatever. And it just went through. She was a real, like Dickensian stuff was a myth. This is in the cities it was concentrated. Like when you see someone on the pavement today, it's shocking, but it's concentrated. Spread that across the country, and you probably wouldn't come across that person.
And my wife and I actually that was on, I think, BBC telly.
Yeah, well, read the book. The book is just amazing. It's a fabulous book.
We loved the series. We used to watch it religiously, and I'm absolutely fascinated to hear what you say there, because I remember saying to her at the end of one of the episodes, "Have you noticed that everyone basically looks healthy?" And this was the 18th century.
Yes,
before 100 years before the period I was just talking about. As you say, out in the countryside, everyone was well fed, they had jobs, and communities looked after their own.
And people, apart from any sort of odd conditions that people had, that was the thing that was taken. But everyone lived to be reasonable age. Kids weren't dying in poverty.
The average age was much lower than say 10 years ago in the developed world or recently, because they had far more, unfortunately, baby deaths. So and they counted in the average age, but it was normal to live to 70. Well, what's the average mortality now for a man? 78. It's hardly changed. 10% difference.
There you go. Wow.
Indeed. So I would bring back free markets and free speech, but it's not going to happen unless, when we go back to how bad it was in the 1970s, if the Great Reset hasn't yet happened, and as I suspect it will have, then someone like Thatcher will take over. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're lost. I'm pessimistic. I'm terrified. I'm telling people as I see it. People have to look out for themselves, because no one's going to look out for them. So there are 3 ways that you can combat. You can't combat the loss of liberties unless you leave the country and find a country which hasn't got involved in all the nonsense. So that's the only way you can get away from losing the freedoms. To keep your standard of living, you have to do 3 things. You have to raise your income by the cost of living. How many people are going to be able to raise their income by 15% a year? Secondly,
government sector maybe.
No, even then they are definitely not going to have 15% wage rises. No way. RPI, the official inflation, is up 7%. The unofficial 15%. Do you know what state pensions are rising by? 3%. So there's no way on earth that those directly paid by the state are going to win in this higher inflation world. So 1, raise their income by inflation. It's not going to happen. 2, they have to cut their spending. Well, if you cut spending, you're not keeping up your standard of living. That doesn't even apply. And thirdly, they have to, in their investments, in their pensions, in their ISAs, they have to be investing in a way that's going to raise their wealth by 15% a year. And they can certainly do that.
And they probably need even more, wouldn't they? Because otherwise you're just standing still, even if you make 15%.
Well, at least you're standing still. At least your standard of living is keeping pace with the extraordinary increase in the cost of living, which we haven't seen in 4 or 5 decades. People have no idea what is happening, is coming down the pike. They think, people actually believe that it's a one-off. these cost of living increases are a one-off, and the government will do something. But they don't realise it's the government that's already done it. It made it happen. They are expecting the government to help them.
Yeah.
They don't realise that it's the government who's done it, and the government that is going to continue to do it to them for the next generation. It's actually not that difficult to keep people's standard of living, but you just have to know what you're doing.
And the inflation, I think the inflation is the one thing, because you and I, perhaps, we probably met probably 12 years ago, and all the things, people would look at you like, what are you talking about? There's inflation coming. There's inflation. They're printing money. It's going to lead to inflation. And now suddenly, the inflation, I think it's something that's actually focused a lot of people's minds. It's like, wow, this is really hitting them in the pocket very quickly. And especially after lockdowns, it's like, I think all these things are clicking over in their minds. But it's very hard to persuade people. It's almost like you just sort of let them come to the conclusion themselves.
They're not going to come to the conclusion because the state will continue to pay vast amounts to the media companies to sell the same message. Most people are not going to come to the conclusion that it's the government, it's the state that's done it to them. They are certainly concerned, but as I say, I have to reiterate, they believe that the government will help them out because the government has helped them out for decades. So why should it be any different? They don't realise that it's all part of the plan.
Yeah, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. The most terrifying 8 words, according to Ronnie Reagan.
Indeed.
Okay, well, should we wrap it up at that? And it's been a fascinating time, and we'll have to get you back, perhaps in a few weeks' time. Well,
sure. Very happy to have had this chat with you, and I hope that some people will be able to take from this something which will help them, if at least to understand what is going on, because if you understand what's going on, then you can then take action to do something to help yourselves. I might just repeat that anyone who wants the free Booms and Busts report, just go on to jonathandaviswm.com and subscribe. They'll never be junk mailed or their details sold. Yeah, and I'll put a link in the description anyway on the podcast. Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Cheers, Andrew. Okay, bye.